The Apostle Paul. That's how we think of him. His name was Paul and his job was an apostle. It's a very holy sounding job. He did other things, of course. He wrote letters, thought grand theological thoughts, but they were all holy things as well. But Acts gives a broader picture. In Acts 18, Paul, the traveller, arrives in Corinth, and in verses 3 and 4 there's an interesting little detail about him. He had a trade. He was a tent maker. We don't think about this much because we prefer to focus on the theologian and the church planter, but the thing is, you can't have one without the other. Without his ability to travel and earn a living, Paul would have had no one to write to, and possibly even not much to say. In the ancient world, tent makers worked with a range of materials, not just canvas but leather as well. So like a lot of craftsmen before and since, Paul was versatile, and he was also able to travel. All he needed was his bundle of tools, knives, awls, sharpening stones, needles, thread, and carrying that he could travel from city to city and earn a living. There were two reasons why people like Paul needed to be mobile. The first was that he consciously decided to take the gospel on the road. He was a travelling evangelist and teacher. And the second reason is that because he was a travelling evangelist and teacher, he was always getting kicked out of places. That's how he arrived in Corinth, in Acts 18. He'd first been kicked out of Philippi and then driven out of Thessalonica and Berea by mobs. But in Corinth he found a home and a workshop with a couple called Priscilla and Aquila. Like Paul, they were tent makers. Like Paul, they were followers of Jesus. And like Paul, they too had been kicked out. In their case, thrown out of Rome on the orders of the Emperor Claudius. We can imagine their living conditions. Corinth was full of shops set around small squares or markets where artisans could ply their trade. Generally, the owners lived above the shop. Priscilla and Aquila probably rented a shop with a room above it. They would have slept in the upper room, and Paul probably slept in the workshop. So that's the origin of the church in Corinth. 3 exiles gathering together in a tent maker's workshop. They didn't have a church building. The early church, whether in Rome or Jerusalem or Corinth, met in domestic settings. There were no official public church buildings as such. For most of the first 3 centuries of its life, the Christian church was a house church. Sometimes Christians went to the synagogue, but they were soon exiled from those meetings. Instead, they met in ordinary places: houses, tenement buildings, apartments, workshops. Acts tells us that the converts of Paul and Priscilla and Aquila eventually start meeting in the house of a man called Justus. But before that, when there was just a handful of them, the first meeting place must have been in that workshop itself. So imagine an early church service in Corinth. They would meet early in the morning or late at night on the first day of the week. They had to meet early outside working hours because Sunday was an ordinary day. And these were ordinary working people. The tools would be put away, the floor swept, the shutters closed, the room lit by the smoky oil lamps. And they would sit there on mounds of leather hides or bales of canvas or the coils of rope, and there in that very ordinary space they would share extraordinary things: the bread and the wine and the stories about Jesus. That's the other thing. They had no Bibles. They might have had some copies of letters or parts of what we call the Old Testament, but they didn't have this, a book with all the official bits in it. They were still writing that. What they had was stories, the things about Jesus that they'd heard and remembered and passed on, and for many of them, what they'd actually seen. It's a picture of church that many Christians around the world would recognise today. Today, the most common place for secret believers to worship is in a flat or a house. So let's picture one of those meetings, today's secret church. It happens in an ordinary house. Individuals arrive one by one at intervals so as not to draw too much attention. They gather in darkened rooms, the windows covered. People sit on the floor, no sermon, no loud music. And like Paul's church, no one has a Bible with them. They might have Bibles at home, kept secret and hidden, but no one carries a Bible with them in public. Instead, they have the Bible in here, in the head, and in the heart. There are churches like that all over the world, in Somalia, in Iran, in Vietnam, in China, anywhere where Christians cannot meet openly and in public. Sometimes the problem is not secrecy, but exile. Many Christians find themselves like Priscilla and Aquila, exiled from their home. In Erbil, in Iraq, one group of displaced Christians has their church in a tent, in the middle of a small square. Paul would really have felt at home. Their former church building is some 45 miles away in a place now occupied by Islamic State militants, but they've learned to improvise. And this is what their church leader says: "We have our prayers and services in exactly the same way as we did in our village, so in this way we remember our church and our village." He says, "Of course, I desire to go back to my church, the place I grew up in, but if I'm called to serve in the desert, I can still serve there. From sand I can make a church." When you have a dangerous faith, you have to be prepared to live on the move. Jesus, after all, was always calling people to movement, because it's only when you move out of your comfort zone that you find out how strong your faith really is. The early church learned that. They learned that because Jesus was always with them, their church could meet anywhere. Their Bible was in their heads and in their hearts. For the persecuted church, the same is true. One of the things which Open Doors does is supply the persecuted church with Bibles, but the words never stay on the page. I've met many Christians from the persecuted church who can recite huge chunks of the Bible from memory. In one African country, I visited a safe house where Christians were learning huge parts of the Bible and were able to recite it by heart. Why? Because they were preparing to move, to return to their homes, where it might be dangerous to have a physical copy of the Bible. So they carried it inside them. And because they carried it in their heads, they also carried it in their hearts. Perhaps around the world we've become too reliant on external helps to our faith. We need our purpose-built buildings, we need our finely bound Bibles, we need our worship band. We don't have to remember the Bible, we can just look it up. And we can easily get obsessed by the ABCs: attendance, buildings, cash. The early church was more interested in the D, the daily life, discipleship, danger, maybe even the desert. Because with the right outlook, you can build a church from sand.